In this lesson, we're going to learn how to place and manipulate objects in the scene. Alright, so now that we know how to navigate the viewport, let's go ahead and hit F with this object selected in the scene, and that will frame in on that object. We can use our middle mouse button to scroll forward. Okay, so if you just scroll that scroll wheel, you can zoom in and out, or you can hold Alt and then the right mouse button and hold that down and move it backward and forward to zoom in. So let's talk about placing in objects. To do this, we'll need to go to our content browser. In the content browser, you'll want to select a folder for things and find the object that you want to place in the scene. So for example, I want to bring in some of my props. I'm going to bring in this crate. All you'll have to do at this point is simply select it, left click and hold on that, and then drag that into your scene. And you'll notice that that pops into the level, and you'll notice that it is colliding with the floor geometry. That will allow us to place things very quickly on different surfaces. So release that, and that's going to pop right onto the scene. Now once we have dropped that, we need to know how to move it around. So to manipulate objects, you could do it a couple of different ways. The first way is to use the Move tool, the Rotate tool, or the Scale tool. These can be accessed in your viewport right up here. So this will move, this will rotate, and this will scale. You could also use keyboard shortcuts to get to those. W will give you the Move tool, E will give you the Rotate tool, and R will give you the Scale tool. You could also hit the space bar, and that will just go through each individual manipulation tool. Okay. Now you'll notice that whenever we begin to move this around, you'll notice that it's snapping onto our surface. The reason that it's snapping is because we have snapping turned on. You'll notice that it's highlighted in orange. If you don't want snapping, you can simply left click on that and it will turn off, and you'll be able to move smoothly. Now most of the time we will want snapping turned on until we're ready to fine-tune our manipulation. So let's go ahead and turn that back on. That should be in orange, and then we could also adjust the amount that it should snap. So if I want this to snap at larger increments, I can go up to something like 100. Let's go ahead and move that around, and you'll notice that it's snapping at larger increments. We could also do smaller increments like 1, and you'll see that that begins to move around. Now that is very smooth, but it is snapping every unit. All right. Now you also have the ability to manipulate your objects by simply going over to its transform properties in the details panel. Let's go ahead and move this over a little bit so we can see this a little bit easier. You'll notice that in your transform properties you have location, rotation, and scale. Location is going to refer to its position, so you can type in values here. So if I wanted to be on the X origin line, I could type in 0 and then enter. You'll notice that that moves into place. Same thing on the Y, 0 and enter. And then even the Z, we have that ability. Now with the Z, I'm going to go ahead and leave it at 20 because that's where the floor is here. If I typed in 0 here, that's going to go through the floor, and we're halfway through. So let's just type in 20 and hit enter, and that's going to be right on top of that surface. Now we also have the ability to move, rotate, and scale on different axes. So right now, by default, with our move, we're moving in the world axis. That can be denoted right here with this icon. Notice that we have that world icon. If I left click on it, that's going to move to the local object space. And what this will do is allow me to see and move the object in its own local direction. Now you may not have noticed any difference here, but let's go ahead and rotate the object 45 degrees. Well, let's go ahead and do just 40 or 50, something like that, because we have that snapping turned on for our rotation. Notice the rotation snapping is turned on here. You could also adjust its increments. Same thing for the scale. So now that we've rotated that at some sort of diagonal angle, let's go back to our Move tool. Notice the Move gizmo now. Notice that the x-axis is pointing straight down the side of our crate. Now if I go ahead and I switch that back to World with the Move tool activated, you'll notice that the gizmo changes. Okay, so now the axis is able to be moved in the world's direction. Let's switch that back to normal, or local, excuse me. All right, so this is a great way of manipulating your objects in both spaces. It's going to be very helpful later on. So now that we've learned how to move, rotate, and scale, let's talk about the different selection methods that we have. Let's say that we have multiple pieces in our scene. So I'm actually going to duplicate this crate a couple of times. So to do that, I'm going to hold down Alt with my Move tool activated, and I'm going to move that in the Y direction. Hold down Alt one more time, left click and hold and drag, and that will create 3 crates. With these crates now in the scene, I want to be able to select all 3 of them at the same time. This can be done in the perspective view by holding down Control and then left clicking on the object that you want to append to that current selection. I can also left click on this while holding down Control and select this one. Now anytime that I want to deselect one of these, I can simply hold down Control again and then left click the one I want to deselect. Perfect. Now whenever working in our viewports, we're mostly going to be working in the perspective view, but sometimes we may want to work in one of the orthographic views. That could be the top view, the side view, or the front view. Let's take a look at the top view. Now in the top view, you'll notice that it looks a lot different. We no longer see the textures and materials that were on our objects. We now see the wireframe on the object. This can be seen through the view mode. The view mode, excuse me. So now that we have this, let's go ahead and switch it to something like the lit mode. Lit mode is going to show us all of our materials with our lighting applied to that. If I go to unlit, it's going to turn off all of my lighting information, but still show me my textures and materials. We can go into things like detail lighting, and this is going to be more for debugging purposes. And the rest of these are going to be the same types of formats. So we can take a look at something like the light map density. You can see that we get all kinds of weird colors, and it doesn't really help us whenever we're placing objects. So let's go ahead and switch this back to wireframe, as this is most helpful whenever I'm working in the top, front, or left view. Alright, so let's go ahead and switch this back to our actually, before we do that, let's talk about the selection in these orthographic views, because it is a little bit different, and even navigation. When in the top, side, or front view, to pan around, you'll need to hold down the right mouse button. That will allow you to pan. Notice that you will not be able to orbit or rotate the camera view. So the right mouse button will allow us to pan. If I hold down the left mouse button and drag, this will allow me to do a marquee selection. So anything that that marquee selection touches, it will select. Now I also have the ability to use the middle mouse button, and the middle mouse button is going to allow me to measure from one point to another. Now it's going to base itself off this snapping, so let me switch this back to 10. If I hold down the middle mouse button and drag, you'll notice that I can measure out certain distances on our objects. And so now that we've talked about navigating in the orthographic view, also selecting objects in the orthographic view, okay, we can still hold down Control and then left click to select those multiples. Let's go back to our perspective view. Now that we've talked about the viewport navigation, we've talked about view modes and placing objects and even selecting objects and even manipulating those objects, let's move on into managing our content. And that's going to be taking a look deeper into the content browser and how we can import assets into our scene.